Well, good morning to you again. My voice is dealing with the allergies of the week. How many of you dealing with that stuff, nasal stuff? Oh, boy. My sister said her azaleas have already bloomed in her backyard. I think that's supposed to happen in April, isn't it? It's getting a jump on us, isn't it? It certainly is. Well, 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, I stepped up to this pulpit, and before I said the very first word, we had to evacuate the building. And that sermon has waited 2 weeks now. So it's here today, unless we get another tornado. Somebody told me when we evacuated over to the new children's building, Pastor, that's the best sermon I've ever heard you preach. And I said, well, it was mine too. Yeah. Well, 6 weeks ago, it's hard to believe that now, I shared with you my intentions to retire. And the next Sunday, Dennis Branton, who's the chairman of our deacons, gave a little presentation to the church, and in that he asked for all of us to pray for the search team that would come together, pray for him as chairman of the deacons and all the deacons, and for all of us, because we are all of us involved in this process. And so last week, the deacons shared with us at our town hall the process that we will be going through. And out in the foyer are the nomination forms for you to write down 7 names of members of our congregation that you feel are spiritually mature. They represent a cross-section of our congregation, and both men and women. So if you've not picked up one of those yet, they're out in the foyer, and you can pick them up on your way out today. And as you pick up a loaf of bread, as you do that as well. Dennis mentioned I'll be starting a new study tonight, and I'm calling it Rage and Reconciliation. I think we've all seen over the last couple of months rage in our country. Protests, burning of buildings, all kinds of things. And I've been impressed to address that. And we're going to be taking a close look of the letter in the New Testament that deals with those two things, probably more than any other, and that's the little letter of Ephesians. And so we will start that tonight, talking about rage and reconciliation here at 5:30. I hope that you can make it. Now, the message for today is calling a new pastor. How do we go about doing that? Well, the deacons have told us about the process, but what I want to do today is to try to help us determine from the Bible, what does the Bible talk about as far as a pastor is concerned? It's not contained in just one place. There are several different places throughout the Bible, but we're going to focus in the Old Testament, Psalm 78. If you'd like to turn to that, Psalm 78, verses 70 through 72. Calling a new pastor. What you're going to see on the screen here in front of you are segments of what this passage mentions as characteristics of a shepherd, of a pastor. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So Psalm 78, starting at verse 70 through 72. He, that is a reference to God, chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds, from following the nursing ewes he brought him, to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. With upright heart he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hands. And of course, this is a direct reference to David when he was a young man. He was a shepherd boy for his dad. David was the youngest in his family. He had a bunch of brothers ahead of him. But God chose him to be the next king of Israel. And in the olden times, they would refer to leaders, kings and others, as shepherds. And so this is what this is directly referring to. But there's help for us here as this passage talks about the qualities or the characteristics of a shepherd. And there are 5 of them, and I want to list them for you this morning. And to remind you that 7 of you, either from this congregation or combination from the second service, there will be 7 in our congregation that will be selected to serve as the pastor search team. They're the ones that's going to go out and do all the heavy lifting, trying to sift through the resumes that will come in. And let me tell you, a small church in Destin recently went through this process. A small church, have about 75 people. They had 150 resumes to come as pastor. I don't know how many we're going to get here, but just realize it's a massive undertaking. And then the whole congregation, when that committee comes with a recommendation and they're 100% unanimous, they bring that person to the church, and then everybody gets an opportunity to hear, to ask questions, do all of that. So all of us are involved. Everybody. No one's left out of this process. So please remember that. All right, the first, and this is foundational, is the call. The call. He chose David. It's God's initiative to put into the heart of a man to be a shepherd. It's God who does that. And if it's dreamed up by a person, then it's not a quality call. I heard the joke one time of a fella out in the field, and he was thinking about becoming a preacher, and he saw the clouds formed, and they formed 3 letters, GPC. And he thought, that means go preach Christ. And then a voice came from heaven that said, go plow corn. But listen to John Henry Jowett. Here's what he said. He must have the assurance that the selection has been imperatively constrained by the eternal God. The call of the eternal must ring through the rooms of his soul as clearly as the sound of the morning bell rings through the valleys of Switzerland, calling the workers to early praise and prayer. It has to ring through the rooms of his soul that it is God who is calling him, the eternal God. So that's the first quality, the God's initiative of a call in the person's life. Now, the ways that God calls is various. Just think of all these different ways. Think of Abraham. There he was in Ur of the Chaldees, a pagan city if there ever was one, and somehow he heard God's voice speak to him inwardly. It was an inward speaking to him. And the voice said, I want you to leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house and go to a place, a country that I will tell you. And Abraham did. He responded to that call of God. Moses, you remember him. He was out, he was doing some sheep work too, on the backside of a desert, and he saw this bush burning. And rather than turning away from it, he was drawn to it. And as the closer he got to look at it, there was a voice that said, Moses, take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. And God called Moses at that point. Isaiah, it was totally different. Isaiah was in the temple. And he heard a voice that said, who shall go for us? Who will I send? Who will we send? And Isaiah stuck up his hand. He said, I volunteer, I'll go. It wasn't that way with Jeremiah. When God spoke to Jeremiah, Jeremiah said, wait a second. I think you've got the wrong person. I'm too young for this. You might get somebody else. And God said, no, I'm choosing you. This is my initiative. So all different kinds. Then there's Timothy in the New Testament. And for Timothy, the call of God came through the observations and comments of others. Here's what Acts 16, 1 and 2 says about him. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. And then in 1 Timothy 4:14, still speaking about Timothy, do not neglect the gift you have, which was given you through prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands upon you. So here the call of God came to Timothy by people observing and commenting, brothers, spiritual brothers saying these things about him. One of the finest pastors that Southern Baptists have ever had was George W. Truett at First Baptist Church, Dallas. And interestingly, his call came a lot like Timothy's. It came through the observations and comments and encouragement of others. And then he realized it was God calling him, and he responded. So there are a variety of ways in which God makes his call known. But deep down, underneath it all, it will be the call of God that will keep somebody in the ministry and not bailing when the times get tough. The call of God is vital. That's one characteristic. Secondly is character. That's the second thing. Notice it says, with upright heart. With upright heart. That's a reference to the interior of a person. That's a reference to character and the absolute importance of integrity of character is necessary in a pastor. James S. Stewart, who was for many years probably the leading evangelical in Britain and Scotland, he said this, "You have chosen a vocation, or rather, Christ has chosen you for it, which more than any other calling in the world depends upon the quality of life and the total witness of character which by the grace of God a man may bring to it." Character. Now we need to distinguish between personality and character. Personality has more to do with the social and emotional aspects of a person. We talk about extroverts and introverts. These are personality traits. Gregarious or private. Sociable or reserved. Those are personality traits. Character, on the other hand, has more to do with the moral and ethical aspects of a person. Things like trustworthiness, dependability, humility, perseverance. Those are character issues. And this idea of leading with upright heart has the idea of character. A person can have a winning personality and a flawed character. Let's take a look at 1 Timothy chapter 3. Keep your finger there at Psalm 78 and turn to 1 Timothy chapter 3. About 3/4 of the way through the New Testament. If you got to Hebrews, you passed stop. 1 and 2 Timothy, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, and Philemon, and Hebrews. 1 Timothy chapter 3, we'll start with verse 1. If anyone aspires to be an overseer, and most translations will use the word bishop there, it's literally overseer, leader, he desires a good work. Therefore, it is necessary that the overseer, pastor, elder, these terms are used interchangeably, to be above reproach. First thing off the bat is his relationship with the opposite sex. Most translations have husband of one wife. That's okay, but it's not talking so much about category as character, and it reads literally a one-woman man. You know, you can be a husband of one wife, but you can be not a one-woman man. And so that's better rendered a one-woman man. Temperate, sensible, orderly, respectable, hospitable, apt to teach, not lingering long with wine, not violent, but gentle, peaceful, not greedy, one who manages his own house well, having children with obedience or in obedience, with all dignity. For if anyone does not know how to manage his own house, how can he manage or care for the church of God? Not a new believer, not a neophyte. That word neophyte comes right out from the Greek language. In order that being puffed up or conceited, he should fall into the condemnation of the devil. And it is necessary that he have a good witness by those on the outside, that is, non-believers, in order that he might not come or fall under the approach and snare of the devil. Notice in this list of characteristics, there are only two that deal with what we would call a skill. Ability to teach is one, and the other is leading your own house, managing your own household. The rest of them are character issues. In every situation, the emphasis is on character. Then if you turn to 1 Peter chapter 5, 1 Peter 5, verses 1 through 3. 1 Peter's right after Hebrews. Therefore, to the elders, I appeal to you, or the elders among you, who, he says about himself, I am a fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ and a participant of the glory that is about to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, taking the oversight, not by constraint or compulsion, but willingly according to God's will, not by shameful gain, that's again, it's greed, but eagerly, and not as lording it over the flock, but becoming an example of the flock. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, you shall receive the unfading crown of glory. Every one of these are character matters, character issues, character qualities. So the second important quality of a pastor is his character, upright heart. Now I want to show you two pictures. See the first one. Nice looking fellow, isn't he? His name is Ted Haggard. Ted Haggard was the pastor of the New Life Church in Colorado Springs, Colorado, for a long, long time. He was also the National Association of Evangelicals president from 2003 to 2006. But everything changed in 2006. He was discovered to be in a homosexual relationship with at least two different men. And of course, the church had to deal with it, and he was not repentant at the time, and he was terminated because of it. Mega church pastor, good-looking guy, all kinds of skill in the world, and had the personality that would fill a room. But what came to be his nemesis was his character. He had a flawed character. And you can have a wonderful personality and preach the stars down, but if your character does not match it, your words are going to be spilled on the ground. Another picture. This is Perry Noble. He was the pastor of New Spring Church in Anderson, South Carolina for a number of years. And in this past summer in 2016, he began to show up at meetings at church inebriated. His life began to just disintegrate. And alcohol was his flaw. He started out thinking that it was just fine for Christians to drink moderately or socially. But when the pressure started building up in his life, and this church was growing like wildfire. They've got satellite campuses all over the Southeast. It's a mega church, just like Ted Haggard's church. But he had a flaw in his character. And he too was terminated because of it. I cannot emphasize enough, we must call a pastor that has character. We must. The reputation, just think of what their families have had to deal with. Think of what their churches have had to deal with out in the community, answering questions and that kind of thing. It's a must. Character is a must. A third quality is competence. It says back in Psalm 78 that he guided them with his skillful hands. This is a reference to competence. A pastor needs to be able to do certain things and do them competently with skill. That doesn't mean they're perfect. You're never going to find a perfect pastor. If we are trying to find a perfect pastor, let's just all quit right now. It's not going to happen. But some skill with some of the things that a pastor needs to do. One is their experience and education. Where does this skill come from? Ecclesiastes 10:10 says, if the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. David's experience and education was forged as he tended sheep through his growing up years. It was continued in the court of King Saul and later surviving the attempts to kill him by Saul. David did not have a seminary to go to back in those days. His seminary was roughing it out in the woods, trying to survive and helping find pasture for those sheep. But today, pastors gain their education both informally and formally. Usually, seminary or Bible college training is a necessary component of his education and experience. But actual hands-on experiences serving in a local church is a key component of his education and experience as well. It is possible to be so heavenly minded that you become no earthly good. That's why I've encouraged all of our seminary students, when they leave here to go to seminary, we've had quite a few, get involved in the local church. Do something. Do something in the local church. Don't just sit in class and listen to the professors and so on. Get involved. Equipping is another part of their education. The gifting by the Holy Spirit. Ephesians 4:11 says he gave, that is the risen Christ, gave some to be apostles, some prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. So there is an equippingness of the Holy Spirit. Some will be stronger in some gifts than others. As you've noticed over the 9 years, I'm not a Billy Graham. I'm just not. I'm a plow horse. He's a thoroughbred. I'm not a Charles Stanley or anybody like that. I'm just a plain, go through the scriptures, pastor, teacher. Every person has their different gifts and skills. And I'll talk about that and the needs of the church in just a minute. Now, pastors, and man, I'm really running behind. They've got to have competence in several areas. One, they must be interpreters of the word. Interpreters of the word. Secondly, preachers and teachers of the word. Third, they need to be counselors of the word. That doesn't mean they may have their master's degree in counseling, but they have got to help people find their way in the journey of the Christian life. Evangelists of the word. This is one of my weaknesses. I'm a very reserved, shy person. I have to work hard at sharing the gospel because I'm just sort of shy. And, you need sort of that outward experience kind of thing. But I do it. Paul told Timothy, as for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, and fulfill your ministry. A prophet of the word, number 5, and then a servant of the word. 1 Corinthians 4:1 says, this is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. That means things like the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is a mystery. You don't handle mysteries just casually. They're mysteries for a reason. Baptism, in a sense, is a mystery. God is able to say things through a baptism. This lady down here told me she was crying as Jason was being baptized today. Mystery. Weddings, there's a mystery for you. Be able to conduct a wedding as a mysterious thing. That's what Paul calls it in Ephesians 5. It's a mystery. Funerals. Things, God can do amazing things at funerals that you'd never imagine. He must be a servant of the word. Now, number 4, the context. He called David to be a shepherd of Jacob, his people, and Israel, his inheritance. The context is very, very important. It needs to be a good fit between pastor and the church, a good fit. Usually geographical and cultural matters come into play. Here's one example. In times past, prospective pastors have looked at our church, but one at least did not like the idea of the military background and the transiency that brings. People come in for a year or two and then they're, transferred somewhere else. They wanted to be a place where the community was stable. People lived there most of their life. That would not be a good fit here at First Baptist Niceville. That would not be a good fit here. You have to be, it's tough to say goodbye to people, but you've got to do it. The military is moving them on. So it needs to be a good fit. The needs of the church and the gifts of the pastor need to match. One of the things that the search team will do between now and whenever they start bringing a candidate, they will probably be asking us as a congregation, what do you think the needs of our church are right now? We need to know that. And so that when they're considering a pastor, do you have the gifts to be able to meet these needs? A third consideration is theology and polity, both of the church and of the pastor. This is vital. Congregational polity is who we are as Baptists. Not every Christian group is congregational polity. We as a congregation make decisions. The budget, calling a pastor, those kinds of things. Other denominations, it's done by another group somewhere else. Congregational polity. Does the prospective pastor believe that? Or does he have a different view of polity? Various theological issues come and go throughout the years. One that is very prominent right now is the issue of Calvinism. Calvinism is a form of soteriology, salvation, and that emphasis has caused irreparable harm in some of our Baptist congregations. In our area, in this Niceville-Valpy area, 2 of our Baptist churches have been definitely impacted negatively by a pastor who believes in Calvinism. You need to be very, very careful about that. And then finally, the leadership style of the church and leadership style of the pastor. Every church has a leadership style. Every pastor has a leadership style. Do they match? If they're not matching, if they're not congruous, then there's going to be conflict. There's going to be difficulty. So context is very important. That's the 4th one, and I'm running so much out of time. Number 5 is care. Notice 2 times in this brief little passage is the word shepherd. Shepherd. Shepherd the people. Ezekiel 34, verses 2 through 4 is very important for the idea and the concept of shepherd. It says this, "Thus says the Lord God, shepherds of Israel who have been feeding yourselves, should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, the strayed you have not brought back, the lost you have not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them." That ought to be placed on the desk of every pastor, that he is to be a shepherd. He's not to be selfish. One of the ways you can tell if a pastor is selfish is what kind of car does he drive, what kind of clothes does he wear, what kind of watch does he have, what kind of house does he live in. Those 2 guys that I showed you on those pictures, you ought to see the houses that they did live in, and the cars they drove. It's very, very important to not have a selfish shepherd. He is to feed the sheep. What does he feed them? This. This is what he feeds us. Not his own personality and thoughts and great ideas. He feeds us the Word of God. Strengthen the weak in faith. Heal the sick, people who are physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritual. Sick. The injured by life, sometimes injured by other sheep. Strays, people have wandered off. Seeking the lost, and not to be excessive and heavy-handed in their leadership. And one of the ways to do that is just don't listen. If a pastor will not listen, you're going to have problems. Now, our church, we have been blessed through the years. We really have. My family has been here since 1967. Many of you have been here beyond that. We have been blessed by a number of wonderful pastors. And it is my confidence that the one who follows me is going to be a fine pastor too. I wish we had more time to deal with this, but we're running out of time. But let's pause now and have a prayer, and then we'll have our invitation.